Podcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, this is Carol Scott with the National Ombudsman Resource Center. I want to thank you for joining today's webinar, What Should a State Ombudsman Expect from the Administration for Community Living Administration on Aging? Our speaker is Louise Ryan, the Ombudsman Program Specialist. She is a former state ombudsman, and so she not only has the experience of walking in your shoes, but now she is has the ability to help us at another level, and we really appreciate that. We are recording this today, so if you have to step away, we'll be sending out a recording of it. I did just send out the PowerPoints, so if you want to print those out and follow along, you may do that. And if you want to ask questions, feel free to type those in the question box in your toolbox, or you can raise your hand and I can unmute your line. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Louise.
Good afternoon, everybody, and good morning. So thank you for joining us this morning. And I did want to encourage you, if you have questions, to raise your hand. When the question comes up, we have time, we can be flexible. And the other thing I would add is that some of you may have seen parts of this before. I'm trying to kind of reach everybody, so if some of it seems like you've seen it, heard it, just figure it doesn't hurt to have some repetition in this job. So with that, I will go ahead and get started. So basically, the purpose of the call is to give new state ombudsmen an overview of the role of the Administration for Community Living and the Administration on Aging, and to discuss what the state ombudsman can expect from ACL AOA, and then also time again for question and answer. So kind of designed to be somewhat informal. So who is the Administration for Community Living, and what is it? So the mission of ACL is to maximize the independence, well-being, and health of older adults across the lifespan, including people with disabilities and their families and caregivers. And the vision is that people, regardless of age and disability, live with dignity, are able to make their own choices and participate fully in society. And I guess I would say when I came to ACL, it was not ACL, it was AOA. I came to AOA in 2011, and in 2012, ACL was merged with other AOA was merged with other programs that had a disability focus. And so since then, we've been kind of making our way in terms of coordinating aging and disability services. And so this slide here kind of gives an overview of what's in ACL. So you've got the Administration on Aging, the Administration on Disabilities, which includes the Administration on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. Of note there is that it includes the protection and advocacy systems, which many of you are familiar with. Often they're called disability rights at the state level. So we oversee that program at ACL. And also the independent living councils, which, as you know, they have a mandate to help people get out of nursing homes. So again, an area where we can do some, and we do some cross-coordination along with the developmental disability councils. So all of that is within ACL. Other programs within ACL are our regional programs, and if you've not yet had the opportunity to meet your state liaison from your ACL regional office, you will have that chance. I think most of you have at this point, at least have met them over the phone. ACL also has the SHIP programs now. It was transferred to ACL from CMS. We also have a whole other section of research-related programs because of the transfer of several programs that were transferred as a result of the Workforce Innovation and Opportunities Act of 2014. So let's see, I can get my slide to advance. So for instance, as I mentioned, the independent living programs, assistive technology programs, the National Institute on Disability and Independent Living Research Programs, or NIDLR. And so basically ACL has now a research arm on disability, sort of like you have your National Institute on Aging or your National Institute on Health. Well, this is likewise the kind of National Institute on Disability Research housed at ACL. So we have a lot going on. So I just want you to have that broader picture, and to also keep in mind, you know, say you want to know more about what kind of assistive technology programs are in my state. We can help you find that out if you're having trouble figuring that out. Also things like maybe you have questions about the protection and advocacy and how to coordinate. Again, we're a resource there. So just wanted to point that out for you. I know some of you have come into the role of state ombudsman, having served in some point in the past as at a regional level of the state ombudsman office, and so you're putting on a bigger hat in your how you work in running a statewide program. You'll find similarities and differences, and so I think this is one where, you know, looking more broadly at coordinating with programs will be one that's going to come up frequently as state ombudsman, and it may have at the local level too, but in a maybe a much more local kind of personal meeting focus than maybe you'll have as state ombudsman, if that makes sense. Just a note about who our leadership is. Lance Robertson is our administrator and assistant secretary for aging. He was appointed and confirmed by the Senate in August 2017. Mary Lazare is our principal deputy administrator, and for those of you at the Consumer Voice conference next week, she will be speaking at the luncheon, so you'll get a chance to meet her. Edwin Walker is our Deputy Assistant Secretary for Aging, and he also serves as the Director of the Office of Long-Term Care Ombudsman Programs. We have Whitney Bailey, who is the Deputy Administrator for Regional Operations and Partnership Development. Some of you met her when she came and spoke at our Denver conference last spring. And our newest leader is Julie Hawker. She just joined a few weeks ago as the Commissioner for the Administration on Disabilities, and I've not had a chance to meet her yet. All of the leadership is located in Washington, D.C. at our central office. I was able to move myself and my job back home to Seattle, so I'm in the regions, but a central office person. And so I will be hopefully meeting Julie next week when I drop by the central office when I'm in town. So just focusing a little bit on the role of the Administration on Aging. As you know, it administers the Older Americans Act. And the Older Americans Act kind of lays out the duty and functions of the administration. And I think one thing that we really take to heart at ACL AOA is that we see that we do have a role to serve, and this is in the Act, to serve as an effective and visible advocate for older individuals, whether that's within the Department of Health and Human Services, other departments, other agencies, federal government agencies, and part of that means that we make an active effort to review and comment on federal policy. We have opportunity to do that internally. For instance, Health and Human Services proposed regulations. We have an opportunity to comment before it goes out for public consumption, and we do, and with other colleagues at ACL, we do take that role very seriously. The other important thing that we do at AOA, and that is the most important to you, is that the Older Americans Act, created and authorizes funds to grants to states. So basically, the Older Americans Act, when it was formed in 1965, created this thing we call the Aging Network, where you have the state units on aging. Many states, most I'd say, have area agencies on aging. Your states are required to develop state plans on aging, and that all kind of stems from the Older Americans Act. And what's also important there is that the Act lays out the kind of the foundation, right? But you also have the money side of it, which comes through appropriations. So there's kind of, the Act is the foundation. Every year we have Congress appropriating funds for the Older Americans Act programs. So just a reminder here, when we promulgated our Ombudsman program final federal rule, it became apparent that some people didn't quite understand how the law and the regulation fit together. So we kind of done this real basic chart here that shows, the law is the overarching, the law is passed by Congress, right? And it is, until Congress makes a change, it is what it is. Then the executive branch agencies like ACL under Health and Human Services gets to write the regulation or the interpretation of the law. And that is a very public process, a lot of review and vetting and responding to the public. But in 2015, we did get, for the first time ever, a final Ombudsman program regulation. And the relevant regulation for the Ombudsman program is 45 CFR 1324. That's for Title VII, which is the Title VII of the Older Americans Act, which is where most of the Ombudsman program language is. Another part of the regulation, 1321, is focused on state units on aging, and there's a little piece in 1321 that talks about the Ombudsman program and the role of the state units in monitoring the program. So we've got our law, which is like our foundation. We've got the regulation, which kind of fills out that structure, that building, if you think of it that way. And then we have the guidance, which could be like the decoration. So guidance could be letters ACL writes to states. The frequently asked questions on the ACL website is considered guidance. We have a few program instructions, not a lot, but that's kind of how that all fits together. So just like to give that visual. So I'm not going to read down this list, but these are just the Older Americans Act, the titles, and the Ombudsman program is in Title VII, Elder Rights Protection. We are Title VII, Chapter 2. And again, what programs does the Older Americans Act fund? I think you're pretty well aware of what they fund if you think of things like nutrition, in-home services and support, senior centers, caregiver support. Also through our Title VI programs, there are services to tribes, similar to what's funded to the state units. Tribes can also apply for and receive those funds, and I believe we fund over 200 tribes. I probably should get the exact number. And so they provide specialized services to their tribal members, but in a similar vein, caregiving, meals, and other supportive services. So I'm going to skip over this because you can look at it later. If you have questions about the Title III program, I think one thing I would say is that some of the Title III programs, the Older Americans Act sort of developed and seeded, and then you'll see things like Medicaid also covering these services and that coordination, and that's part of the goal of the Older Americans Act is to coordinate with other services and to kind of maximize the efficiencies by, say, combining efforts when it makes sense. The other thing the Older Americans Act calls for is for what we call technical resource centers. And so we are very fortunate to have the National Ombudsman Resource Center, which is required in the Act for AOA to establish. And you're experiencing one of the things they do regularly and with very great expertise is to provide training and technical assistance to both state ombudsmen and local entities, representatives of the office. The Resource Center also has a role to analyze laws, regulations, programs, and practices and educate ombudsmen on those practices and laws. So for instance, if you look at the Resource Center website, you'll see all kinds of information on the fairly new nursing home regulation. They also have a lot of assistance on recruiting and retaining volunteers and all of that kind of program management. And you'll learn more about the Resource Center, but we're very fortunate to have a Resource Center. And I'm the project officer for the Resource Center. So I work with them on their work plan, kind of reviewing the training and technical assistance materials, and we have a very close working relationship. So how does this all relate to you and your job as state ombudsman? Well, I think that the biggest first step is that ACL issues the formula grants to the state unit, and which includes the money for the ombudsman program. So it's not like we give a separate line item from ACL direct to the Office of the State Long-Term Care Ombudsman. Our grantee is the State Unit on Aging, and then the State Unit on Aging, again, grants that money to your program, the Title VII Chapter 2 money, and any 3B money that they might also provide. With the state unit being the grantee, we kind of have a dual role of making sure the state unit does their job and supporting you to do your job as state ombudsman. So ACL, the regional office, does review and approve the state plans on aging. We coordinate and work together to provide guidance and interpretations on both the Act, fiscal questions that come up, and the regulation. Again, that kind of technical assistance or other interventions. Right now, we're working on an evaluation of Older Americans Act programs, and I'll talk about that in a minute. We provide the framework for the National Ombudsman Reporting System, or as we call it, NORS, and then again, funding technical resource centers. And I might add, we have other resource centers that I think could be of great benefit to you. The National Center on Elder Rights. We fund some legal resource centers, and we try to make sure that our resource centers collaborate when it makes sense to do that, to kind of maximize that efficiency of resources. A little bit about program guidance and interpretation here. The one thing I'd really want to direct you to is to the frequently asked questions on the Ombudsman Program Rule. I think it really addresses some of the sticky issues that have come up, like, well, what does it mean to have adequate legal counsel? Or what does it mean to work full-time? Or what's the difference between my systems advocacy work as a state ombudsman versus a representative of the office? So a lot of good questions and answers. Those questions came from the field. The answers went through, again, anything we post publicly has been reviewed and reviewed multiple times, and these were also reviewed by our Office of General Counsel, so these are like our final answers here. So there's a good one on mandatory reporting. Can ombudsman programs be mandatory reporters? Short answer is no, and then it explains it. So as I've mentioned, we have regional support centers which provide technical assistance to states, AAAs, and others in the Aging and Disability Network. And again, this is where when questions come up, so for instance, Texas had a question about systems advocacy. The region drafted the letter in coordination with central office folks. Same with questions in California, North Carolina. We've had questions or issues that we've identified. And so we, again, write these letters to give guidance. And those letters frequently are helpful to other states. So it's not like a one and done kind of thing. So with regards to the regional support centers and your state liaisons, when you have questions, they're generally your first point of contact when you have questions of ACL. But I also like to say there's no wrong door. If you go to them and it really should go to me, they're going to loop me in. If you go to me and it's really more like, well, this, I really need to call on the fiscal expert, I'm going to loop that person in. So we always share information about questions that come up. The other thing is sometimes you might ask a question and we might say, well, this might be better for the resource center. So, we really try to make sure the communication goes back and forth so that we can be thorough in responding to your question. So for example, one time a new state ombudsman had a pretty technical question about the nursing home regulations around eviction and discharge and kind of how to support getting a resident to return to the facility. And so that was one that went to me because that was one that regional state liaison had some knowledge, but not enough. So, but we work, again, very closely. The other thing is I'd say most now of the regions have quarterly or maybe it's twice a year calls with ACL. And those calls we want to be for your benefit. What would you like to discuss? What would you like to learn about? Certainly guest speakers can be invited. Sometimes CMS is invited to join the call. So that's another thing that is offered. The other thing state liaisons do is site visits for compliance reviews. Sometimes the site visits are by phone, but as much as possible, they try to have them be in person. And I'm just going to stop and get a sip of water and see if there's any questions. I believe we have 9 people on the call. At least that's what my phone said, or my computer says. So any questions at all?
Not so far. I do, Louise, this is Carol, just want to mention that it is very nice having you and the regional office support when questions come in. And I will tell people that when you ask NORC a question, some of those we refer you on to Louise. When it's more of a policy issue, unless it's just something we can say, well, here's what other states are doing. But we really appreciate the relationship, and also just reiterating what Louise said, that question and answer page on the ACL website is one that we NORC staff frequently are looking at, and would encourage you every once in a while just to go out and just look over them as kind of reminders as you're working on either policy development or guidance for your local staff.
Yeah, and sometimes I think it's helpful, say there's been questions about non-ombudsman staff accessing ombudsman records for monitoring purposes, for instance. So maybe at the state unit level or the AAA level, they want to evaluate the records, the resident records. And, it's very clear that they can't. It's very clear in the rule, but there's still been some pushback. And then it's like, well, then just designate me so that I'm a designated representative of the office. Then I can look at the records. And we have a FAQ about that. Can somebody be designated just for purposes of reviewing the records? And the short answer is no, that's not appropriate. So you know, some of those sticky issues we've addressed in those frequently asked questions. So yeah, the other thing is, with regards to what Carol was saying, is that I think at ACL, especially since the rule was finalized, we've really tried to strengthen the Office of the Ombudsman program at ACL with the regions and strengthen that link. And I would say the state liaisons have done a lot of work on helping states to implement the regulation, and they have learned a lot about the Ombudsman program and are much, I'd say, stronger in their understanding and of the program, which has gone, I think, been really helpful, I think. So just a few words about the Office of Long-Term Care Ombudsman programs at ACL. It's now housed within the, well, it's housed within the Administration on Aging, and then within that, the Office of Elder Justice and Adult Protective Services. So as I mentioned, Edwin Walker serves as the director of the office, and then Hillary Dallin is my direct supervisor, and she's also the director of the Office of Elder Justice and APS, and she's a great support. She's very interested in the program and in strengthening the program, especially strengthening relationships with like-minded entities. She's worked in legal services in her past, and so that is a special interest of hers, how to help the program have stronger relationships with legal services. So, and then what I do is, you know, kind of support the states in their program operations in coordination with the regions. I'm the programmatic lead for the National Ombudsman Reporting System, both its current state and the new design and new data collection. I'm the project officer for the Resource Center. And then I also have this kind of role with my central office hat on of responding to policy issues that come up with regards to long-term care residents, whether that's in proposed regulations by other agencies like CMS or just other you know, venues like the Elder Justice Coordinating Council, or providing information to the National Alzheimer's Partnership Program, the federal program that ACL also chairs. So different things there that I do. So I wanted to just talk for a minute about some of the kind of historically, some of the state issues that ombudsmen have been challenged with. And then I also want to talk about some that I'm seeing now that are slightly different. So historically, some of the issues have been things about the ability for the state ombudsman to have that independence, to have that independent voice to solve resident issues, in particular with regards to doing systems advocacy. And I'd still say that's an area where ombudsman programs are coming along, but also where we still need to work with states to move the needle there, both in educating the state unit and other programs that are within the, or what would I say, other agencies that in some way at the state level affect the ombudsman program, and then also in supporting you as a state ombudsman in giving you the tools, you know, through the Resource Center primarily, and how do you do systems advocacy? What does that mean? So it's kind of the, does your system support you doing that? And then do you feel you have the skills to do that? And what are some small steps to start doing systems advocacy? I think sometimes people think it just means legislative work. Well, there's all kinds of things in between. The other thing is your ability to communicate to the general public and the media. You know, how much control do you have over your website content? Are you able to just kind of put out newsletters or other information, media releases, etc.? Some states historically have tried to give state ombudsman other jobs like APS director and ombudsman and legal services developer. So we've been able to really put our foot down on that with the regulations spelling out what we mean by full-time, and that there can be short-term interim, maybe where you take on an extra role for a very short-term thing, or you know, we have a little bit of carve out, but basically by full-time we mean you are full-time on the state long-term care ombudsman program. There's been some challenges, and this came up a lot with the rule implementation, about the role of the ombudsman to designate individuals and local entities. And I think with some states, there was some angst that AAAs have had about, well, wait a minute, I hire this person. What do you mean you designate them? You know, what do you mean you get to have some oversight of their work? So some of that challenge. Also, just in general, the idea that the state ombudsman designates local ombudsman entities. And of course, with designation, you also have de-designation, where things aren't working out. So that kind of notion has been, I think there's a deeper understanding of what that means, and that it can work quite well to designate entities. What's important, of course, is your grants, your contracts, what have you, in carrying out that work. Access to adequate legal counsel has been a challenge. And then, of course, this notion that ombudsman program information is confidential, not to be shared with others outside the program, that for some states was a challenge to kind of come to grips with what that meant. And that's why we have the rule. That's why the rule finally got developed. You know, we had this wonderful Older Americans Act with great language in there about the independence of the program and the confidentiality of records, and all of that is in the Older Americans Act. But when states read the act and then they look at what's going on in their state, it got implemented in a lot of different ways. So the rule helps to kind of bring states more in alignment, with more consistency, because we've filled in the details. So, and you can see, if you've not looked at the rule, I would say that is a must to read that, bookmark that. I must open up the regulation almost every day to look at something or a question comes up. And, you know, you've really just got to have that in your back pocket, because when you are questioned about your authority, etc., you've got that as a starting place. And then, of course, ACL can provide extra support if you need it. Couple things going on at ACL. I mentioned the NORS. We've been working with quite a lot of focus on a couple areas with regards to NORS. One is that we are going to start new data collection October 1st, 2019, which means that right now with the NORS data, you've got 119 complaints and you've got 9 different disposition codes and all that. We've scaled things down. We've, I think, simplified some things, but we're also going to want technology to do more for ACL. So we've got new data collection starting October 1st, 2019, and there will be training. The Resource Center is almost in the kind of final phases of developing training on the new codes. And then we have our new software system. And so we've piloted the software system. It's called OAPS, for Older Americans Act Performance System. So we've piloted it. It went pretty darn well. We're kind of making it as perfect as it can be. And so that's going to be very exciting to start getting data in a new way at the federal level, where we will have the ability to do more analysis of, especially of complaint trends. So more on that. We are also working with another entity called NORC at University of Chicago, who is working on a program evaluation study. So first they did a study design, and now they're doing what's called a process evaluation, and then they're just beginning to start what we call an outcomes evaluation. I'm learning so much about evaluation and how much is involved. So Basically, as part of the process evaluation, all state ombudsmen were interviewed. There were surveys sent to local ombudsmen, either those who are in a lead role or at a staff level. And then also there was 27 states the volunteers were surveyed. And so if you're not sure if your state was one with volunteers that was surveyed and you want to know, I've got the list and can let you know. Many of you had a chance to meet Kim Nguyen, who's the principal investigator. She was at our spring training, and so you probably are aware of this, but we are getting closer to the outcomes evaluation, which will mean things like perhaps focus groups with residents or other ways to get information directly from residents, facility staff, family members, and more information coming from ombudsmen, state ombudsmen, and representatives of the office as well. A few other things, we're still kind of working through CMS issues related to nursing home initiatives and guidance around the nursing home regulations, working, coordinating in areas around legal services, protection and advocacy systems. The other thing I'm trying to finish up, and for most of you, this is not an issue, but trying to finalize a few more states to get the 2017 NORS data final. And there will be upcoming training on the current Ombudsman reporting tool and how to complete your NORS report, which is due in January. And so stay tuned for more information on that. And I think all of you are familiar with NORS, so I'm not going to spend time on this other than to say that NORS is in the Older Americans, they don't call it NORS in the Older Americans Act, but they have these requirements in the Older Americans Act for the state ombudsman to issue an annual report that describes resident conditions, talks about, describes the complaints, those things. It's in NORS. It's in the Older Americans Act. It also specifically calls out describing the challenges and experiences of board and care residents. When you submit your NORS report, you have fulfilled your responsibility to report to the Assistant Secretary on Aging, because in the Act and in the rule, it says you are to report to the Assistant Secretary on Aging. When you submit your NORS report in the Ombudsman reporting tool, you have fulfilled that requirement. You may wish to send a pretty report to us, and that we love them because it frequently gives more information than what's in NORS, and you're welcome to do that. I think the most efficient way is just to send it to me and I will distribute it. But just so you're aware that people get confused about what it means to submit to the Assistant Secretary. It means get your report done in the Ombudsman reporting tool and get it to the point where it's certified. And this is what the reporting tool currently looks like. It's going to change a little bit. One thing I will say about the reporting tool is that you can run a lot of reports that you may not have in your own system, so you'll have a chance to see that. I'm going to skip over this. I already kind of talked about the new NORS system, so I'm not going to spend time on this other than to say I can't wait until we start implementing the new codes and the new system. And I think that states are going to find, once they make the transition, that data collection will not be so burdensome. So, what should you expect us to do? We are there to help you to solve those challenging problems, providing technical assistance around NORS or fiscal questions. We do represent the program at the federal or national level, so it really does help for you to keep us informed. A couple things I will say before I talk about emerging trends is that you also need to think about the ways that you keep us informed. having really good systems, issues, narratives, and complaint examples in NORS is really valuable. And I use really good examples with other federal agencies, for instance. Emailing is great. Just remember, when you email the federal government, it can be FOIA'd. And by FOIA'd, I mean Freedom of Information Act. There's nothing that you send me an email that you can ever assume is private or confidential. So, you know, if you feel like you have something super confidential to discuss, it's best to pick up the phone and dial. So I just want to, you know, really reinforce that. We have had a Freedom of Information Act request on a communication with the state ombudsman, and we did have to turn that over. So, you know, we can't say no the way you can say no. I am not an ombudsman. I am a federal employee. I am not a national ombudsman or anything like that. I am a ombudsman program specialist, and my role is to ensure that our grant to the states is carried out appropriately. So just really want to emphasize that. It is, you know, a good idea sometimes to pick up the phone and call first and say, you know, here's my question. I do need to get an email trail, but how should I frame it? What am I really asking? Just kind of discuss the issue can be really helpful. So a couple of things I wanted to mention that I've seen as kind of what I'm calling emerging trends is, one is, how do ombudsman programs respond to the inappropriate transfers and discharge notices? So as you know, the SNF regulation requires the nursing home to send notices to the ombudsman program. And some programs have been deluged with everything, including residents who have died, residents who were there for 4 days and went home, you know, the whole 9 yards. And trying to sort out how to respond, how to kind of call who are the residents truly in need has taken a while to kind of get, you know, to figure out. I think ombudsman programs are getting a better handle on this, and the resource centers got some great technical assistance and some state examples that are really helpful. Additionally, we had a little extra money at the end of this fiscal year, so we were able to provide a supplemental grant to NORC to provide some intensive technical assistance. It'll be to a smaller group of states. We want to do a really kind of deep dive to come up with some really kind of, you know, very detailed hands-on tools that will then be shared with, you know, the rest of the network. So stay tuned. NORC will have more information on that. Other things that I'm seeing that I call kind of programmatic challenges, a lot of states are changing their data systems, and we've got new data collection coming up. I think as states change their data systems, they're finding maybe there was big holes in what they were using before. Some states have had lapses in having a software program. So they're kind of stuck with nothing for a little bit. One state kind of lost data in the, you know, there's all kinds of peculiar things that have cropped up as states change their data systems. And, you know, I think if you're looking at changing or, you know, looking at you're going to change your data system, you know, don't hesitate to reach out to me and see if I can steer you to other states and lessons learned. I also, the vendors often call me with questions, and it's okay for them to do that. So the vendors, or even if it's your state IT person, they're welcome to call, and they do, or they email. The other thing that's going on is we've had states, some states that never had policies and procedures, or they were really old. So we've had new state ombudsmen either coming in to implement new policies and procedures that they didn't write, or having to write policies and procedures. So that's been a big lift, but it's very exciting to see that we are pretty much at a point where all state ombudsman programs have policies and procedures. Maybe not quite finished, but almost. And that's a first. So that is, I feel like, a big reason to celebrate. And that's kind of one of the things the rule required. Now, of course, you thought writing them was hard. The big challenge is implementing them and making sure that they don't sit on a shelf and collect dust, but that they drive the program practices. So that's, I think, kind of an emerging trend. And then, of course, funding for the program is always a perennial challenge. Some states' fiscal situations are quite healthy right now, and so things are less troubling for some states, but other states are having big financial challenges. So, you know, you're one of those states or somewhere in the middle where things are kind of business as usual. So that's, I believe, you know, my last slide. Just one thing here, just to kind of bring it back to our founding father, Arthur Fleming, who basically said, you know, that it's great to pass all these laws and regulations, but if they're not being applied to the individual, they might just as well not have been passed or issued. And so we kind of take that to heart. That's your challenge when you're out in the field assisting residents, is how do you breathe life and meaning into those resident rights laws and those quality of care requirements. That's the heart of the matter. And likewise with your program policies and procedures, how do you breathe life into those to support residents? So I think I just kind of like to end with a reminder of who started our program, and that whole idea of the early roots of the program always had a volunteer base to it. That idea of neighbor helping neighbor, I think, has been a strong principle of the program, that you know, if you don't have a volunteer program or you feel you need to build it, I think you'll find lots of good reasons to do that. So just putting in a plug there. And now I'm ready to turn it over for any questions. And again, here's my contact information. And don't hesitate to call, and don't hesitate to email any one of us. So thank you.
Louise, thank you so much. So if anyone has a question, on the toolbox, you can click on the raise your hand, or you can type into the question or chat box. Louise, I just wanted to kind of maybe give people a heads up that at the orientation at the Consumer Voice Conference, you are going to be spending quite a bit of time talking about funding. I know you kind of, you've mentioned that here, but there's been a lot of questions, you know, from especially new people. And I just want to let everyone know that you're going to be kind of going into the weeds a lot more on that issue, and people will be able to ask questions in a atmosphere that will be very helpful.
Yeah, and I'm thinking we'll be, you know, I'll have a PowerPoint, but it's going to be more of a discussion. And so I think some of the questions I got were around kind of how do you even figure out what's what? And then what does all this other stuff mean, like around minimum funding? And so I'm going to try to kind of tackle a couple areas. You know, one, even how do you, you know, again, literally, you know, where do you find this information on the ACL website, like the funding allocation tables and those things. So going to be pretty hands-on. And then I want to talk about some other kind of issues that have come up recently that I think as new state ombudsman, just kind of things to think about, whether it's talking to the media, how do you kind of get a handle on your program, just kind of, so again, more of a discussion. And likewise today, you may not have a question, but if you have a comment, feel free to raise your hand.
Perfect. Well, so far everybody's being fairly shy. Not sure why that is, but sometimes that happens. Um, you also mentioned NORS. I'm assuming that at the NASOP meeting, that will obviously be something that you'll be giving everyone kind of an update on where you are, because you are one of the guest speakers that come into the afternoon session at the Consumer Voice. That would be Sunday afternoon.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we're basically on track for the new data system and, you know, the training that the Resource Center will provide this summer. So, yeah, but definitely I always can answer questions and give more information. I think, you know, we're trying to figure out for everybody the transition. How do you transition from old data collection to new data collection? And there might be things that we're no longer asking for that you still might want to collect. So you have to think about those things too. So yeah, and so we'll be doing some further work on that this year. The other thing I should mention is the training standards. There's a requirement in the Older Americans Act that ACL develop some training standards, including minimum hours of training, and I'm getting close to having a draft done of that. So that's something that will be coming down the pike soon to talk about and kind of finalize. So there's been a lot of work done on this with stakeholders. So again, we're kind of in the home stretch there.
So Louisa, on that, will the state ombudsman see that before it's final, or will it just come out as here it is?
No, they'll have a chance to see it. And again, it's kind of based on the report done by the Resource Center, who convened a work group on this. And, you know, at some point, you know, I've just got to put a fork in it and say it's recommended these many hours, and you know, and so there has to be, you know, it's required to have a minimum number of hours, and I think I'm trying to come up with a reasonable number, but some people aren't going to be happy with it. For a lot of states, it won't impact them, but you know, so that's just you know, again, in the works. So,
and that probably means that some states who've maybe just finished creating or updating their policy manual may find that they're going to have to address some policies because of the training standards.
Yeah, they may need to add more. Certainly, if you already are doing more, then, you know, you don't really, as long as you've covered the topics, and the topics are pretty high level. It's not like we're going to get into the weeds about, you know, how you should do certain types of training or those things. So, you know, I think most state ombudsman programs agree there's some fundamentals you've got to cover in a certification training. So, yeah, but I think for those states that maybe are doing pretty minimal training, they're going to have to look at how to ramp that up. So,
okay, well,
and
thank you.
Offering flexibility there. So,
okay, yeah. Well, and if anyone is interested in seeing what NORC, the recommendations that came out of the work group, we'd be happy to let you look at that. Although at this point, maybe that's we'll just maybe sit back and wait and see what the final or what the proposed regulations are. I will mention that if
it's not a regulation, though. It's not a regulation.
Oh, sorry. So it'll just be so what will it be?
It's a good question. I think I would call it guidance.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, you know.
Okay.
But I think looking at the report, if you have the interest, will kind of tell you the recommendations and the thinking of the group of stakeholders, which includes state and local ombudsman, providers, other folks. So, yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you for correcting my language. I will mention that, you know, NORC keeps and puts on the website the policy manuals of states that send those in. So if you have a new or updated policy manual and would like to have it shared, lots of people, as they're developing or looking at modifying, will go out and look at other states to just see what they have. So NORC does not review those for compliance or anything like that. We just simply put them on the website. And if we, maybe see something that doesn't look right, we might gently say, hey, could you take a look at this? But it really is, Louise, you guys at ACL have been the ones who've kind of been reviewing those to ensure that that the right ones are there and that they're not saying something that's contrary to the Older Americans Act or the rule, correct?
Right. So we've been doing that. It isn't to say something could have slipped us by, because it's a lot of review. But yeah, and especially with states who maybe didn't have anything, we've worked pretty closely with them to make sure they're staying in, consistent with the rule and the act. So yeah, so if you've just recently finished yours and ACL reviewed it, it would be awesome if you could share it with the Resource Center. So.
Sweet. Okay. Well, everyone else is being quiet, so I think at this point, excuse me, Louise, I want to thank you. I want to thank the new state ombudsman who have been listening in. And just as always, Louise is a great resource. And so we thank you. And we'll hopefully see many of you on Sunday. And if not, we look forward to seeing you in the sun in Orlando next May. So, yeah. So thank you all and have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you, Carol.
Hey, you're welcome.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.